it's really nice to meet someone who has experienced non-duality, and I experienced that, I think, at a very young age, and so it's nice to see that people are kind of, it seems to be expanding an expanding experience for
right.
us. I'm not sure why that is.
Probably just mass media and the fact that you hear about this now a lot more than the past.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So we get, the communication is more global, and yeah, that would have been great at 8 years old if I could have had that connection. So it's taken me a while to connect with others that have any clue what I'm talking about. And that's not to sound critical or minimizing. It's,
Right.
it's kind of like having another language, or knowing that another land exists that a lot of people don't seem to be aware of, or at least at one time didn't. So, yeah, this is great. So, you shared so much on Buddha at the gas pump, but I'm going to go over a couple things that you've probably already shared, for my viewers, and made a couple notes for myself. So at age 40, after reading 100 books or more, you began to meditate, to have a meditation practice. And after about 5 months, you said you had a huge cosmic consciousness experience. So what was that like?
It was unbelievable. But it was actually, as soon as I started meditating, and it may be because I spent 20 years thinking about this stuff and reading and trying to understand these existential issues that I wondered about. But really, shortly after I started meditating, the effects were very, very rapid in my case. And so I was initially started just 1 hour a day doing a little simple breath awareness exercise. And then within 2 weeks, I had an extra hour of just walking through the countryside, seeing if I could just look without thinking about what I was looking at, because I was really curious about the internal dialogue. I had read in a Carlos Castaneda book many years earlier, the Yaqui sorcerer in the book had told Don Juan that it's possible to stop the internal dialogue. I didn't know if that was possible or not. I really doubted it, because as soon as I started doing the meditation, the internal dialogue was just incessant. It's what Zen calls monkey mind. The mind just jumps from one thing to another, and it replays conversations from last week, and it worries about what's happening tomorrow and that type of thing. But I just kept doing that for some reason, just was attracted to that. And then after about 5 months, I was doing 3 hours a day, and sat down one night and fell into these very deep states of mind. And then on the fourth day, I had this fantastic experience in which it answered about 7 of my questions, and just catapulted me into a different world, unlike anything I'd ever imagined before.
Yeah. So how would you, for someone who doesn't have any idea what cosmic consciousness is, how would you describe that? Based on your experience and maybe just your knowledge of cosmic consciousness.
Yeah, I had read about experiences like that, but had no idea what they were talking about. But it's an event in which selfhood disappears. There's no separate observer. It's like there's just oneness, and it becomes very obvious that oneness is all there is. So everything's connected, everything's unified, and in some way, there's a direct apprehension of the absolute, which can't even be described. It's incomprehensible. And I never thought it was possible to feel that good as a human being. And the actual event only lasted about, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes, start to finish. The reality just disintegrated. And instead, I was just catapulted in the same world that Eckhart Tolle writes about after his big experience, in which everything just comes alive. And there's like, everything's a living presence. And then there are many unusual aspects to that. It affects perception and everything else. And after about 20 minutes, everything got back to normal, or I thought it got back to normal, but it really had not. And the lack of selfhood, the selfhood was gone for about 3 days. And I had no interest whatsoever in anything personal. So I was ready to give away everything. It was really quite amazing.
So when you say, and maybe these weren't your exact words, reality disappeared. I don't know if that was the words you used.
Began to,
So what? So I mean, how?
yeah, it would be like if I were looking at you right now, it was like the features of your face, everything was beginning to come loose. It was like everything was floating on a fluid substrate. And then, at a certain point, when everything disintegrated, then all of a sudden there was just oneness. And it was just a completely different kind of reality altogether.
So then coming back out of that, and as time went by, was there a process of integrating that experience of oneness and coming back to where the mind tells us everything is separate and we have labels for everything? And was there an integration process for you?
Yes, and the integration process, to be honest, took about 15 years because many other things happened over the next 15 years. Because once that happened, I had thought that it was a scientific search for understanding. I didn't even realize it was spiritual until it happened. And what was encountered, I suddenly realized this was a spiritual search. It really wasn't a scientific search. And I just wanted to understand what had happened. So as I had mentioned in the other interview with Rick, it was sort of like after 3 days, it was like an electrical circuit shifted and began to come back to true norm, what most people consider ordinary reality.
Yeah.
And that was quite a dramatic shift. But from then on, I just wanted to understand more because I knew what had happened. And, I had a whole completely different understanding of reality after that. And I felt like, well, if I could become sufficiently silent, I could stay in that incredible state, and not come back to normal. And so that was really what led to the 15 more years of searching and going on retreats in an effort to not only understand what happens, but how this plays out long-term in one's life.
Yeah. Yeah. So before that, the hundreds of books that you read, were they spiritually based, science based, a combination of things? Or because what were you kind of seeking in your reading?
Well, for the first 11 years, I was just strictly reading books on philosophy, science, quantum mechanics, that type of thing. And then when I met my wife, and she had signed up for an Eastern spirituality course, and when I began to read those books, I realized that those guys had found what I was looking for. Because when I would read about their lives, I realized that they were living the kind of life Jesus Christ lived. They only were interested in helping other people. There didn't seem to be any personal selfhood involved in what they were doing. They were just very unusual state of mind, obviously. And the first book I wrote, which was in '98, was called A Path to Christ Consciousness.
Yeah, I was going to ask you.
I wrote newspaper columns for about 10 years about this, trying to explain what we would probably call mystical Christianity, a different interpretation of the New Testament, really. Because after the cosmic consciousness event, I then reread the Bible, and it was like a whole different book. I understood Jesus Christ in a completely different way. And I'd often wondered, well, what could account for the miracles and the unusual stuff that happened that's described in the New Testament? After that, I understood how this could happen. Reality can do anything.
Yeah.
And so just like your experience at the age of 8, those are the type of things that most people never experience. So they have no frame of reference for it at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's fairly common in the mystical path.
Yes, yeah. So a lot of times people that are seeking, at least in my experience and people that I've talked with, and a lot of times what puts a person on a spiritual path or a seeking path is some kind of suffering.
Correct. There are actually 2 main reasons. I used to think that everybody was like me, motivated strictly by curiosity. I was just intellectually curious. And I thought, well, that's true for everybody. But the more I've talked to people, we form a fairly small subset. Most people are driven by wanting to escape suffering.
Yeah.
And so that it's the people who are trying to escape suffering, it's a little different pathway.
Mm-hmm.
I had very specific existential questions that I wanted to understand. And people who have experienced trauma, childhood problems and that type thing, and are wanting to escape, feelings of negativity about themselves, that type thing, they're usually on a little different pathway. They're usually certain kind of emotional blocks. And when you hear people on that path describe what happened, there's much more of a releasing of feelings that have been suppressed, things like that, and various kinds of trauma being released, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. And those would be blocks. And what they're blocks to is what I would call the true self, the self that you kind of came in contact with. And it happens to some people just in a spontaneous way too, without even searching. It just can happen. But yeah, in that trying to ease suffering or escape suffering, sometimes people hit some kind of bottom or multiple bottoms, and kind of in a cry of desperation, they reach out, and sometimes they find that there's something more there.
That's right.
Yeah.
And, Rick Archer has had interviews with a lot of people who've had that happen.
Yes. Yeah.
I was particularly struck. He's interviewed a lot of people that I know, as a matter of fact, but I remember one interview with Terry Stevens in Australia, because he was somebody who suffered abuse as a child and went through therapy for years, and nothing seemed to help. And at a certain point, like you say, he hit rock bottom, and he had reached a point where he basically said a little prayer to God, and he just said, "Enlighten me or kill me. I don't care which." It was and the moment after he said that, or very quickly that, his mind suddenly stopped. It just stopped. All the internal dialogue stopped, and he was in silence for 2 months. And he claims that he sat on his front porch and just looked at the sky for 2 months. And at the end of that 2 months, bam, he woke up, the mind began operating again. He went and found his abuser, who was still alive, forgave him, and felt compassion for him, because he understood, what was going on. He saw a bigger picture. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And that's an unusual case, because here was somebody who had significant trauma, and it all just totally evaporated. So there's some amazing stories out there.
Yeah, and it gets a little confusing, I think, the language sometimes for somebody who hasn't had the experiences. For example, like self-realization. Well, that if you don't know exactly what that is and haven't had an experience, self-realization could make someone think it has to do with the persona or personality. So what self are we talking about in self-realization?
That's kind of an interesting question, because in talking to people over the last many years, I've discovered that people have a different sense of selfhood. For example, I always referred to the sense of selfhood that I had as the hardcore sense of selfhood. I had very strong interests from a very early age, and I identified very strongly with those interests. And fortunately, I had parents that were totally supportive. So whatever I was interested in, they were just sort of fascinated. They went along with it and supported it. A lot of people aren't that lucky.
Right.
And so in my case, I always thought of myself as a geologist, an astronomer, a scientist, and I was always, I'm a this, I'm a this, I'm a this, I'm a this, which creates this sense of like there being a little person inside your head looking out at a world out there.
Yeah.
So when I talk to my daughter about this, she understands exactly what I'm talking about. My wife has no idea what we're talking about. She never understood what I was talking about, because she has a much more diffuse sense of selfhood.
Ah.
And so we went to see the movie Men in Black. It's kind of a funny story. And in that movie, there's a sequence where the little alien's head opens up, or it's a human form, but the head opens up, and there's a little guy sitting at controls inside the head, pulling levers. And my wife looked over and she said, "That's what you've been talking about." And I said, "Exactly. That's what it felt like. It felt like there's a little person in here making things happen and directing things and being in control of things and that type thing." So like in my case, I would always sort of look inside to see what I thought about something or what I felt about something, just to sort of check in, that type thing. There was a distinct sense of inside versus outside. And so on August 18th, 1999, I was hiking up this mountain, had this extreme experience of gratitude. And a few hours later, I looked inside and there was nothing there. It was all gone. The little guy was gone. The inside and outside, that whole boundary thing was gone. Mm-hmm. And it never came back. So there was never again a sense of inside and outside.
Yeah. And that's a really hard, I don't want to say concept, because it's not about concept, it's experiential. It's a really hard thing to grasp, that there really is no inside and outside. The way I think a word I would use is kind of seamless, like it's seamless.
Right. It's like and it's not really an experience, because this happens just like that. It's a sudden realization. You suddenly realize there's no me, it's vanished. All right. And you realize that instantly that there never was a me. The whole thing was just an illusion created by cognition. And now with brain science, you know, the brain scan people tell us that they have what's called a default mode neural network. They can actually see when you think self-referentially, like they'll tell people, they'll put them in a brain scanner and they'll tell them to think about themselves. Well, a particular circuit lights up in the brain. People who've meditated for many, many years, if they think self-referentially, that doesn't light up. It's like there's a different pathway somehow. The circuit shifts or something. And that's a little bit what it was sort of like, it just disappeared. It was vanished. And it never came back, you know?
So from that place of no self, such as, you know, Irma, the persona. So in your experience or experiences, or how would you define it? How would you define it? I mean, words are, we need to use words, but
yeah, once the sense that what I'm going to call a conventional sense of me vanishes, there's still a body and there's still a mind. There's an organism here. All right. And we call it an individuation or an individual. All right. Just to distinguish it from a person. We usually refer to the normal sense of selfhood as a separate volitional person. All right. And that's gone. So there's no longer a separate me that thinks it's in control of anything or directing anything. What is realized when selfhood vanishes, you suddenly realize this vast intelligence that I first encountered 15 years earlier, that's what runs the whole show. So it's sort of like, I like to ask people, how do you circulate the blood in your body? You know, how do you make your heart beat 100,000 times a day? How do you grow a single hair? Nobody knows. How do you see, or how do you think? You don't know, because you're not the one doing it. You know, there is no Bob, Betty, Jane, Carol, anything else. There's just what I call this, which is the absolute or the infinite, or whatever words we want to use, source. Somebody in a book I was reading the other day, I think it was Sailor Bob, was calling it a vast infinite field of energetic intelligence or something like that. There's really, whatever words we use for that is just a pointer, because it can be directly apprehended, but it's not directly apprehended by a person, right? In other words, for the longest time, I thought that I had a cosmic consciousness experience. When selfhood disappeared, I realized that wasn't true at all. The infinite had somehow apprehended itself. In other words, the true self had somehow apprehended its own true nature at some deep level. And that's totally beyond human comprehension. Anybody that encounters that, all one can do is simply bow down in front of that, because you're instantly full of humility and just awe at what is realized and what's seen.
Yeah. So I have two questions around that. One is, no self and what you just described, then how do relationships with others play out in the sense of staying attached to those we love? because it seems like part of the attachment has to do with an identity of self. Do you know what I mean by the question?
Yeah, sure. And so ordinarily, we relate to other people through a me. We say, I'm in love with that person, and it's personal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Selfhood's gone. It's not that way at all. It's sort of like, this is just what the infinite does. That's just how it manifests. The fact is, each person you meet is the real you. There's no separation at all, right? And in a human form, or if you're an animal, or if you're a bird, or whatever you are, and you're attracted to another animal or bird, that's just how this manifests.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that makes sense.
So it's a direct apprehension of what's going on. And there's no longer the idea that there's a me in love with someone, except in a conventional sense. We still use language. The problem is, what happens is, as we grow up from childhood to adulthood, little children are unified. All right, they're separate. Okay, but the mother or the father says, you're John or you're Carol, and I'm Mama or Dada, and we begin to immediately make these ideas that, oh, I'm separate from them, and then they say that's a tree. Oh, I'm separate from the tree, and they point out thousands of things, and as we grow up, we make millions of distinctions. And all these distinctions get internalized in the subconscious, so that as an adult, we don't really have to think about this stuff. If the mind goes silent, you don't have any problem knowing what's going on, because it's all internalized. That's just part of the vast intelligence that's running the show. And so I try to explain to people that the intellect, the little part of the mind that makes distinctions, right? It's like a tiny computer inside the vast computer. That's one way of putting it. It's like it's a tiny level of intelligence that's part of the vast intelligence. So that's just how humans have evolved. We've evolved the power to imagine. All right. And that's both a blessing and a curse, because I can imagine a future house that I'm going to design. I can imaginally walk through the spaces in that house before it's ever been built. And I could design a rocket to the moon or whatever. And that's the power of imagination. All right. But it's also a curse, because it makes us think that we're separate from everything else. And there's no real separation.
I get all that. I just wonder, on the planet Earth, why currently at this time are we imagining fear and violence and division and things like that? Why do we choose to imagine that rather than love and connection and oneness? Not that you have all the answers. It's just like, questions that are coming up.
Well, and some people don't imagine that.
That's true. Yeah.
People don't have that problem. In other words, if you really see the big picture, you literally accept whatever's happening, because you realize that whatever's happening is an unfoldment of the infinite. Okay, so people will say, well, there shouldn't be war. My response is, there is war. There's no doubt about it. People do hurt each other. People do all these different things. That's just how reality unfolds. Perhaps as humans, have more and more these kinds of things where they suddenly see the big picture, hopefully there'll be a lot less than that. Every person I've met who's gotten free really only wants to share that with other people, and they want other people to feel the same level of freedom and happiness that they feel. I don't think I've ever met anybody that didn't want everybody to be happy and fulfilled and so forth and so on.
And it's very hard to harm another person when there's a recognition that it's all one. It's like harming your own self.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in the New Testament, when Jesus says, treat other people as yourself, he's being literal.
Yeah.
But most people think it's figurative.
Right.
He means they really are yourself. They're your truth.
Yes.
So hurt them, you're hurting yourself.
Right. Another question that came up when you were talking about no self, aren't humans somehow different than nature and animals in the sense of we are aware of ourselves? And is that part of the problem?
That is part of the problem. And the fact is, humans have been very successful as a species simply because of the power of imagination. One of the reasons we tend to be the dominant species, because with imagination, we figured out how to kill off the mammoths and the big animals and so forth. But, you know, in a certain sense, we've run amok because we're wiping out everything, you know.
Yeah.
And so everybody thinking about this personally looks at it differently than if you're looking at it impersonally or from this broader perspective, let's say, a more unified perspective.
So based on that, fast forward, I don't know, 1,000 years. What do you think we are capable of as human beings if over time more people wake up to that unified consciousness to
It's really unknowable. There's no way to know what's going to happen next. And actually, people who see the big picture become very comfortable not knowing. There's no expectation. There's no desire. There's no worries about the future. You simply respond directly to what's ever happening. So this path is a path really of also becoming present, because most people live in their heads and they live in the past, or they regret the past, or they worry about the future and so forth. But for people on this path and who've had these kinds of events happen, they're very focused on just what's happening right now. And that's it. And they respond directly to that. That doesn't mean that they won't send money to help various causes, to charities, to the politician that they think will improve the world or whatever. But everything that you're doing is empty, because you don't know what the result will be, because you also accept the fact there's no me doing it, right? It's like whatever the body does is what the entire thing is doing. The whole universe is connected. So I often I ask people things like, well, okay, where's the line separating your head from your neck? Well, if they try to find that line, they realize it's imaginary. There's no line separating head from a neck. So I also use the example of a hand. I say, okay, this is actual, we call it a hand, right? But a hand is just a distinction. It's a way of imagining what we're looking at. But if I ask people, well, where's the line separating the hand from the wrist? They won't find it. If they try to take a magic marker or a pen, where do you draw that line? There's no line there. It's imaginary. It's like lines of latitude and longitude. All lines of distinction are like that. There are no boundaries. So whatever the hand is what the wrist is, what the arm is, which is what this body is, which is what everything is. It's all connected, and there's no boundary. The boundaries are all imaginary. Now, some boundaries seem very rigid, because we look at something like a rock, let's say, or an automobile.
Yeah.
But if you're a scientist, you know anything at all about science, you know that an automobile is oxidizing every second. It's changing right before our eyes, but at a very slow rate. There's no real boundary there.
So the reason, say, for example, this chair I'm sitting on, the reason I can sit on it is it's possibly vibrating at a slower vibration or something. I don't know if I'm putting that well.
That's okay. Einstein actually has a quote about that. I don't have it with me right now, but he has a quote about that, because one of the paradoxes in modern physics and mathematics and so forth, there are a whole bunch of observer paradoxes. But basically, one of the things that quantum mechanics now realizes that if you have a paired set of subatomic particles, all right, they have something called spin. Well, the spin is related. You could separate these particles with 1,000,000 miles. And if you change the spin of one, you automatically change the spin of the other, which means that's what we call non-locality. And it's also the basis for why in all religions you have these stories of miracles. And even in the Zen tradition, they have what's called the Zen circle. You start off with what we call attachment thinking. You're attached to name and form. Oh, that's a tree. I'm Bob. That's a wall. This is Irma on the screen in front of me, and so forth. Once you meditate a certain amount of time and you go a little further than that, then you encounter emptiness. And you can get attached to emptiness. Some people do. If you keep going, you enter a realm that we call the realm of magic and miracles, where all kinds of weird things can happen. But if you keep going all the way, you come right back to zero again, all the way around the circle. The difference is this: when you're initially at zero, you have what we call attachment thinking. When you go all the way around the circle, you have non-attachment thinking. You're simply not attached to thoughts in the same way as before. Basically, your mental habits have all changed based on what you realize and what you've experienced along the way.
Because a lot of thoughts aren't necessarily our own.
None of it's our own. None of it belongs to me. All right. In other words, if a thought occurs, it's because the entire field of being, the infinite unified field of being, is thinking that thought in this particular form. So you don't have a single thought that's yours. Every thought that occurs, like if I ask you, what's the next thought that's going to occur? You don't know.
Yeah, that makes sense. So some other questions. Since Jesus wasn't a Christian and Buddha wasn't a Buddhist, if one was born on an island and raised on this island and never read the Bible or was never exposed to religion, could they experience self-realization and connection with the infinite? And what would it be called? And
I love that question, because I like to ask this question to a lot of people who are like, I love to ask ministers. We have a couple of Methodist ministers in my family, my wife's family. And I frequently say, okay, let's assume that someone is living on a desert island and there are no holy books of any kind.
Yeah.
Can that person find God? Or can that person find the truth?
Yes.
Right? No one will ever engage with me on that, because they can see where that's pointing. And it's too frightening to consider. If you're very attached to a belief system, you really think you have to have a Bible to find the truth. If you're very attached to Buddhism, you think you've got to have the Buddhist sutras. If you're a Muslim, you think you have to have the Quran or whatever.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's very frightening for somebody who's attached to a traditional belief system. That very question is frightening. And I can see it in their face when I ask it.
Yes.
And they usually just change the subject because they don't want to deal with it. All right. Because yes, if you were on a desert island with no holy books of any kind, you can find out exactly what Jesus and the Buddha found out.
Yes. And part of the reason I asked that question is because at 8 years old, I had not been taught a religion, but yet I had a unified experience. And it was after that connection and that kind of waking up at 8 years old, then I was taught about a religion and what that religion called God. But I knew I had already experienced what they are identifying as God.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. That's huge. And I can see why it scares people, because a lot of people build the foundations of their life on their belief system.
No thought is true. In other words, it's sort of like, take the hand again. All right. If I say this is a hand, that statement's both true and false at the same time. It's true we can make the distinction, this is a hand, for purposes of communication. And that's really why we make all these distinctions, because we want to communicate with each other, and we need a common set of words that point to common distinctions that we all agree upon so we can communicate. All right. But it's also not true that it's a hand in the absolute sense, because whatever this is also what everything else is. So every statement's like that. And so people who are very attached to a belief system, whether it's Christianity or Buddhism or Hinduism, it doesn't matter. When they're very attached to that, it's frightening to them to let go of that. Because I'll have people say, well, why would you be moral, for example, if you didn't adhere to some belief system?
That's a good question.
Realize that this is already moral, right? The whole thing is. And in fact, one of the things that is directly perceived in a cosmic consciousness event, you realize love is the foundational aspect of all of reality. It's hard to put into words, but you realize in that kind of an event that the infinite cares about everything at a level that can't even be imagined. And that's something that's just not even easy to even talk about, because it's a direct apprehension and it's beyond language.
Yeah.
It can't really be captured in thoughts.
A higher intelligence, and I think I've heard you say in a couple of your different talks, that's running the whole show.
Yeah. It's what's circulating blood in the body. It's just that as humans, we're conditioned to think that, well, the blood circulating in the body and all these various physical activities the body's going, those are all autonomic functions. People don't realize that everything is like that. Every thought that appears is just like the blood cells moving through your body. It's all autonomic, if you want to call it that. It's like all there is the infinite, and it manifests just like this. At the moment, it's talking to itself.
Yeah. I get that. As I was going through, thank you for sharing all of that, because these are questions. I mean, I'm similar to you, as I've always had this great curiosity and still do. I mean, to me, that's what makes life very rich, is that curiosity. So it's not like, you become self-actualized and then, you're done and life is boring.
No, far from it.
Something I was wondering when I was going through all your material, when you had that sense of self suddenly vanish, you were on a solo mountain climbing. I was wondering, as I was reading that, do you think that was part of what kind of opened you up to that you were really kind of in the flow, maybe not so much in the mind?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
In matter of fact, I had been doing a particular meditative activity off and on for 15 years, where I was continually shifting attention away from thoughts to just what I could directly interact with through the senses, call it direct sensory perception. In other words, I was actually practicing what little children do normally, because little children interact through their senses. They taste, feel, smell, touch, and so forth. All right. And I've been doing that for years. And as I did that, it was very much like I tell people it's a lot like learning to speed read. If you decide to learn to speed read, I took a speed reading course one time, you first have to break the habit of going back and forth with your eyes horizontally. All right. You have to begin to learn to look at the middle of a line or the middle of the page. And then you have to break the habit of subvocalization. People don't even realize they're doing that until they're told about it. And then after breaking that habit, you got to break the habit of saying these words in your head, because that's all very slow. It's all very linear.
Mm-hmm.
So a speed reader looks at a page of print and understands the meaning directly.
Mm-hmm.
So little children interact with the world in the same way. They're interacting directly with what is. All right. What happens is very gradually, so gradually they don't realize what's happening, they gradually begin to live more and more in their heads to this meta reality that's created by the intellect. So as they begin to learn the words and the names for everything, and they begin to identify themselves as separate from everything else, and they begin to think about themselves and how they relate to other people and what other people think about them and so forth, they begin to live more and more through the intellect rather than through their body.
Mm-hmm.
And so they live in their heads, and they worry about the future, and they worry about what people think about them, and they may develop a negative image or a positive self-image, and they have all these ideas that are just continually bouncing around. In Zen, we call it monkey mind. So that by the time you're an adult, your mind is just jumping from one thought to another. You may be remembering a conversation from last week. You may be projecting ideas about what may happen in the future and so forth. And the mind's just going all over the place. So as you practice shifting attention away from thoughts to just what's right in front of you through direct senses, the mind begins to slow down. It develops what we might call spaciousness. And eventually it becomes possible to be aware of total silence, and the mind has become totally silent, and awareness is there. Now, one of the other interesting aspects, if you're a meditator, in these very deep states of meditation, everything disappears. Thoughts all stop. There's no perception of anything. And yet, the one thing that remains is pure awareness with no content. And I sometimes, in talking to people who've never had that experience and have never been in that state, they can't even imagine it. And I tell them that's because it can't be imagined. It can only be directly experienced. And so in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, which is the deepest state of mind there is, there's just this blissful state of pure awareness. It's as if you became a rock and you sank to the bottom of a deep sea and you just sat there on the seafloor. It's blissful. And people like Ramana Maharshi evidently stayed in that state for years. Most people stay in it for an hour or two, or if they're on a long retreat, maybe several hours, maybe occasionally a day or two. So in other words, in my case, since I shifted attention away from thoughts over and over and over again, and it got into where the mind was very silent. And I found this is true when I would go on these solo retreats. I just happen to like hiking in the mountains. And so I would do these week-long hikes and treats where I would go off, and every day I would just hike in the woods. If you really start really looking at the world, and I'm talking about, you're looking at the clouds, you're looking at the way the roots of the trees go down into the ground, day by day, there's a growing sense of unity and communion with the world around you. It's hard to describe. I've talked to a lot of people that have gone on solo retreats, and many of us have had exactly the same sort of thing. That sense of communion and that depth of unity can increase day by day. They even have a word for it in Japanese. I can't remember the exact word. I think it's called jiriki. It's a certain kind of, they call it a spiritual power. I wouldn't call it that, but it's a deepening sense of unity that can continue to increase. In my particular case, on that particular retreat, I'd hiked for 3 or 4 days. And from the moment I left home to go to the airplane to go to Denver, from the moment I left home, I'm just looking and listening.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Anytime a thought shows up, I'm shifting attention back to looking and listening. On the airplane, I'm just looking and listening. Getting my rental car, I'm looking and listening rather than thinking. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So after several days of hiking, I just happened to have gone to a satsang with Gangaji, and I had an interesting interaction with her, and I was feeling just really unified because it had been 4 or 5 days I'd been doing this. And on that day that I hiked up this particular mountain, and I'd hiked up it once before in the past, I got to a point where all of a sudden I was just overcome with gratitude. This just spontaneously appeared. And I got very emotional. And I really said a prayer, which was just, thank you for everything, for life, for all the good experiences, the bad experiences. It's just really wonderful. Everything that's ever happened has been great. And I got quite emotional, and afterwards just felt really light. So if you've had a good cry sometimes, you know how you feel light and buoyant afterwards, all right? And it was sort of like that, but there was also this sense of, there was just something vague missing. And then an hour or two later, I happened to look within, and it was all gone. It was like the whole story. I realized that the story of Bob had just been a fiction. It had been a fictional story about a fictional person. There had never been a Bob Harwood. There had been a body of mind organism, but it had not been in charge of anything. It had not directed anything. It had not control. It had never made a decision. It had never made a choice. I realized this is what had done everything. I just call it this. Nisargadatta call it that. You could call it source. You could call it the infinite. Anything that you feel like.
Yeah. What you were saying before about little children and, direct, I don't know what you called it.
Direct sensory perception.
Yeah. Based on the 5 senses?
Mm-hmm.
Because what I was wondering when you were sharing that, do you think little children have intuition?
Yes. As a matter of fact,
Because that would be a sixth sense.
yeah, we could call that a sixth sense. And intuition is really what I would call body knowing. It's like some deep sense of knowing about what's going on. You know, many times people intuit something that there's no way to have known that. All right. Maybe we could call it gut level knowing or something like that. And what's really interesting is I've talked to a lot of people who, between the age of about 6 and 9, have had experiences very similar to yours.
Yeah.
And apparently, until we really have made this transfer to where we're living in our head all the time, it's really amazingly common. I can't tell you how many different spiritual teachers have talked about experiences just like the one you had when they were 7 or 8 years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because apparently the boundary between, let's call it, the ordinary man-made world of the intellect and what's actual reality itself, with a reality with a capital R, that boundary is not nearly as rigid in a child as it is in an adult. They're much more connected.
So I have a question around that. If we allowed that to just unfold in children, don't we have to teach our child that fire is hot? I mean, doesn't there have to be an awareness, possibly, I don't know, of separation before you can at some point return to oneness, in the sense of, isn't there, if a child function and continued to function without any fear or any awareness of fire is hot, couldn't that be dangerous? I don't know if that makes any sense. It's just
It does, except that particular example might not be too good, because you have, the Greeks distinguish between gnosis, which is direct experience, and episteme, I think is the word for intellectual knowledge. All right.
Yeah.
So you have direct knowledge and intellectual knowledge. If a child touches something hot, it knows it's hot without having to have a name for it or without having to have thought about it. If you touch a hot stovetop, you don't have to think anything, jerk your hand away.
Right.
So that's not the best example, but another example might be as if an adult told a child, it's dangerous to cross a street because something that's imaginary. A car might come down the street and hit you or whatever. Yes. And I don't see any way that you could have children grow up without being taught all the same distinctions. All children are taught everywhere. So apparently we have to go through that whole process of living in our heads before we can ever get out of our heads. That's part of having an imagination.
Yeah, I kind of think that's true. And also I was wondering, given that at this point in time, we do have to use words to communicate with each other, I wonder at the same time that I kind of know, aren't we capable of communicating through what some people would call telepathy? Like, aren't there different levels of communication happening all the time that maybe we aren't aware of? And possibly if we became more aware of those, our intelligence to that higher intelligence would rise. I don't know.
No, I think that's true, because in my case, I was always more of a thinker, where my wife was a feeler. And she would describe how she would go into a room, and she said, it's like I have little antenna reaching out there to see what everybody in the room is feeling. Yeah. Right. Since I was a thinker, I didn't respond that way. But after I got free, I'm much more that way now. It's sort of like I'm aware now. I can feel what other people are feeling in a way that I never could before. And it's sort of like I think there's probably all kind of subliminal stuff happening. I really believe that the intellect is like the tip of the iceberg, and the vast of what's underneath that iceberg is what's all kind of stuff is happening, because it's all connected, and this vast intelligence permeates all of it. So yeah, I do think that there's, we're already beginning to find ways that people who are paralyzed are now finding ways by placing certain kind of electrodes, they can pick up on thought signals and translate and allow people to move things just with their mind alone. Because apparently now we're realizing that there's sort of electromagnetic radiation constantly from the brain and from the body, and there's all kind of subliminal stuff happening. I'm much more sympathetic to that now than I was before, because now I'm a little like my wife. I can go into a room now and I can sort of sense when I meet people where they're coming from and things that I didn't pick up on when I was just a thinker.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yes. And at the same time, I do wonder, because what you're describing is you developed a sense of empathy.
Yes.
And I have that very strongly. I can pick up on a lot, but from the place of self-realization and all is one, what am I empathizing with? I mean, do you know what I'm saying?
Well, when you realize there's just one intelligence here that's doing everything, all right? It's aware of the whole thing. It's aware, and through an individual organism, it may be aware more in one direction than another direction, all right? But it's just one thing doing it all. And so when you read these stories in the spiritual literature, some of them are just astounding about, like there's a famous Zen Master, his name was Obaku. And Obaku told his disciples, and this is like about 900 years ago, and one day he said, I'm going to be murdered 3 years from now. And when I'm murdered, I'm going to give a loud yell that will be heard for miles. 3 years later, during a period of unrest, the monks left the monastery, but Obaku stayed there. And sure enough, bandits showed up and they murdered him. And he gave this yell that supposedly could be heard forever. Well, almost 750 years later, there was a famous guy who later became a Zen master named Hakuin, who read that story, and it really bothered him because he thought, why would a great Zen master give a loud yell upon being murdered? He clearly foresaw what was going to happen. And there are all kinds of stories like that I could relate that I read about. Some of them are very contemporary. And he was really disturbed by that. He thought, what hope do I have, this pitiful little monk here in this monastery, of attaining anything when a great master like Obaku would give a yell when he was murdered? Well, he later had a gigantic cosmic consciousness event, and he told the people around him, he said, lo and behold, I am Obaku, alive and unharmed.
Oh my God.
In other words, he became one with Obaku, with the whole field of being. He understood everything in a completely different way. All right. And like the most recent example I can think of is a British guy. You can go on YouTube, and his name is Paul Morgan Summers. Okay. And he's very much like Ramana Maharshi in what happened to him. He was 16 years old. He was kicking a soccer ball around. All he wanted to be was a soccer ball player. He wanted to be a professional soccer player. And he was out in his backyard. They lived by the ocean. He was kicking a soccer ball around. And all of a sudden, right out of nowhere, this guy had no questions. He was not spiritually inclined. None of that. He wasn't a seeker or anything else. He suddenly felt compelled to sit down on his back porch. And when he sat down on the porch, all of a sudden, bam, he had this phenomenal thing where he said, I became the ocean. The ocean was kind of a symbol for him because he lived by the ocean. And he said, I was enveloped in the ocean of all being. And he went off, and after that, it's very much like Ramana Maharshi. He left his parents a note, went to London and stayed in a Vedanta monastery for a while. And he said, I don't talk about a lot of the stuff that happened, but he said, I knew my wife's name 2 years before I ever met her. He said, I could tell you all kind of unbelievable things that happen, what we would call non-local kind of events. All right. And he said, but I don't talk about it because people get real attached to that kind of unusual stuff, sort of like the Baku story.
Yeah.
But if you'll go and just watch his interview,
Paul Morgan
Summers, Somers. Check him out. He's really, really interesting. I think it's there's one YouTube interview called maybe an evening with Paul Morgan about non-duality or something like that, and you'll get a sense of what happened to him. It's an astounding story, and that happens to a lot of people. And if you read a lot of this literature and you watch a lot of stuff now on YouTube, you know, it's like 50 years ago when I had all these questions. I was curious. There was nothing out there.
Yeah.
You know, there were no books telling you anything about this. You know, we got just a few new books coming from Alan Watts and a few people on the West Coast, and maybe the first Zen Master, D.T. Suzuki or somebody like that.
Yeah.
And
So how was that experience for you, given that you went through that, but there wasn't a lot available that you could relate to as far as what you had experienced?
Well, actually, you know, as I say, I spent 20 years thinking about it because I didn't have any sources, and I thought and thought and thought and could never find the answer to a single question. And the only reason I started meditating really was just to get a little peace of mind, because I was in business and I had a lot of business related stress. I was worried about customers and clients and money and all that kind of nonsense. And I was driving around, and it began to dawn on me. I wonder if the mental dialogue, this internal dialogue, is increasing the level of stress I feel. And I didn't know it, but every bit of the stress is coming from all these thoughts. All right. I just didn't know it at the time. But I had begun to suspect that. And that was an intuitive thing, you know. And so I became curious. I read this I happened to pick up a new book, and it said, do this little simple exercise and it'll help increase peace of mind. And I thought, oh man, I'm desperate. I'll try, you know. And then just almost immediately, within 2 weeks, stuff started happening. And then once a couple of the big things happened, then I went, whoa, everything I want to know somehow in here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's just a matter of how do I get in touch with this?
Yeah. Huh. So a question that just popped into my head is,
and where did that question come from?
I have no idea, Bob. Possibly what I call my curiosity.
Easy. Go ahead.
Now I forgot my question. Oh, now I remember. Given that in a way we're participating in making this up as we go along, I wonder if, you know, part of the reason that human beings live in the physical body, anywhere from, you know, depending if they have good health, you know, 80, 90, 100 years, whatever. I wonder if the reason that is because we believe that. That's what we believe is the limitation of being in physical form.
If you live to be 80 years old, it's simply because this, in the form of a particular body, lives to be 80 years old. It's just the way reality unfolds.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the future, who can say what would unfold next? I have no idea. It may be that humans at some point will make a huge jump. Maybe telepathically, all kinds of unusual things might happen in the future. All we can really say is that right now, it manifests just like this.
Yeah.
And so just from reading my stuff, you probably remember that one of the big realizations that occurred long before I got free was I had a fantasy of running off to the wilderness and being in isolation and getting enlightened and all that. And it was a fantasy, but I didn't realize it was actually sort of an escapist fantasy, because it felt like it would be exciting and fun to just go off with and leave all these responsibilities of work, you know, being married and being in a family and managing a business and all that. It'd really be exciting to go off and find the truth on a mountaintop and come back, that type thing. And so one day I had this sudden realization. I had that thought in the middle of some construction work. And all of a sudden I realized how the thought separated me from the truth of what is, what's happening right this moment. Asked myself the question that a lot of people have found very helpful. I said, what must I be doing this moment? Not 5 minutes from now, but this moment.
Mhm.
And I realized I had to be pouring concrete. I had to be doing exactly what I was doing.
Mhm.
And that was huge because since I love my wife and my child, and I actually enjoyed construction a great deal when I wasn't thinking I ought to be somewhere else, that
Mhm.
really brought me back home. I then realized, okay, the Buddha had to run off to get enlightened, and maybe Jesus was single, who knows, but he apparently was in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights or some such thing. But if it ever happened here, it was going to have to be right through the middle of running a construction company and living an ordinary life, an ordinary householder life, we'll call it. I wasn't going to be a sannyasa and head off and leave my family or anything like that. I didn't want to do that. But when I had that realization, it really helped because it took away the future and it took away all these fantasies. And from that point forward, I didn't fantasize. It's sort of like it just eliminated that whole aspect. It's like a pattern of thought just disappeared. And that was very helpful. So a lot of times when I'm giving talks to people, I'll say, what must you be doing this moment? And there'll usually be a moment of silence, and then suddenly I guess we got to be sitting here, listen to you. And I'll say, yeah, what have I got to be? I got to be sitting here, talking about non-duality.
Right.
This is how reality manifests.
Yeah. And you do have a book called Pouring Concrete that people can get on Amazon if they're interested. So I kind of jotted this down, and from that curiosity place, and being a person that does have a lot of empathy and compassion for people that are suffering or just suffering overall. So my question is, based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and at the bottom is survival needs, safety, shelter, things like that, and it's kind of a pyramid shape, and it's a hierarchy. And now they've added to the top self-realization, and then above that transcendence. So my question is, can a person that is suffering in a sense of not having enough to eat, or not having clean water to drink, or they're just in survival, is it possible? And I would imagine the answer is yes, that anybody can connect at any time. But I wonder how much more difficult it is when somebody is just struggling in survival.
It can happen at any time to anybody. And on some of the non-duality meetings, we have several folks that got interested in non-duality because they were alcoholics.
Mm-hmm.
They went through the AA program, and some of the stories are truly mind-boggling. I can think of two right off the bat in which these individuals had just an unbelievable event happen to them. One guy was standing in Hobby Lobby, and all of a sudden, bam, and he had been an alcoholic for 20 years or something like that. His life had really been destroyed by alcohol. And I think he was on the 12th step of Alcoholics Anonymous, something like that. Mm-hmm. But basically a higher power type thing. Mm-hmm. In the middle of Hobby Lobby, all of a sudden he fell to his knees and he had this massive realization that he would never again touch alcohol, had no interest in it whatsoever. And that so stunned him that he became interested in spirituality, because he realized he hadn't caused that to happen. Something else had caused that to happen. And I've heard of at least 3 alcoholics with exactly the same story.
Yeah.
So even somebody who has had a lot of really bad experiences and a lot of negativity and so forth, and addiction or whatever, it can happen at any time to anybody. Mm-hmm. It's really, really amazing.
Because in the 12 steps, step 11 is sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God. And step 12 is having had a spiritual awakening. I mean, so the 12 steps are really a great formula to follow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just really, think about that sometimes, about all the suffering in the world and people that are in that place of barely surviving, fighting for their survival. And I wonder, somebody like that coming across a video like this and be like, what are those people talking about? And just feeling so far away from, maybe looking at us like we can only have this conversation because we're in some sense of privilege or mode of privilege.
Right. I used to have the same thought. I used to think, wow, if somebody in a good situation like I live in can't get it, what about the people who are in a really bad situation?
Yeah.
The fact is, anybody can get it any time. It's really mysterious. It just
Yeah.
depends on what the circumstances are and what triggers the kind of insights that occur. And it's really mysterious.
Yeah. Yeah. And something I realized in this conversation is I think part of my questions come from a place of stepping into some place of the God position, because when you are really in the oneness and in that connection with the infinite, you let that higher intelligence run the show.
True. And go far enough, you don't even have to think about it.
Yeah.
It's like everyone is in the flow of life, whether they realize it or not. They're always in this seamless flow of life.
Mm.
You really get free, you really feel it then. You feel one with what is, but you don't reflect about it. So life becomes very simple and very ordinary. Everything's very direct. So again, if you're not, most of us spend so much of our time in imagination thinking about what might happen or thinking what has happened. We're not here now psychologically. We're always here now. You can't get out of the now, right? But most of us psychologically are generally living elsewhere than here and now. So we're not responding to what's directly in front of us. We're so often responding to what we think might happen or what has happened in the past, or they have all kind of ideas about themselves. And so, in America, we're a very materialistic culture. So you have people thinking, well, I'll be happy when I get a new car.
Right.
Well, it's a good thought to get rid of. If you really want to be happy, don't expect anything, don't desire anything. Americans are really bad about comparing themselves. You see on TV the Kardashians and all these ultra rich people with their $1 million yachts and so forth. And there are people thinking, oh boy, if I could live that kind of life, I'd be happy. That's what Zen calls comparing mind.
Yeah.
You'll be a lot happier if you don't do that. We have all these mental habits that keep people being unhappy.
Yeah.
Because of the way they think about reality.
Yeah. And the pursuit of happiness is an endless pursuit that if you do think you find it, then you'll just get tired of that eventually and go back on the pursuit.
Right.
So in closing, and I know that neither one of us has any answers to this because we're not the ones running the whole show. But in a sense of maybe pondering, what do you think happens when the physical body drops?
Great question. So the way I explain that one, and I say, okay, I love to use this because Alan Watts wrote an essay about a fist. He said, when I open my fist, I think it was like 50 or 60 years ago I read this. He said, when I open my fist, where does it go? And he said, we realized in opening our fist that it was a verb masquerading as a noun.
Mm.
So I just expand on that. I'll say, okay, when I close my hand, a fist comes into existence. I open it, it goes out of existence. If I close my hand, a fist appears. If I open my hand, it disappears. In a certain sense, when I close my hand, a fist is born. I open my hand and a fist dies. All right.
Yeah.
Now, this is a metaphor for exactly what Ramana supposedly said on his deathbed. Supposedly, someone asked him, "Master, are you leaving us?" And he said, "Where could I possibly go?" All right. Because we're this vast, infinite, unified field of being. So the fist, even though the hand is up, it's still here. It's just not in the same form. These forms are constantly transforming. And if you see deeply enough into this, you'll realize that you were never born and you never die, the true self.
Mm.
All right. The body is born and dies, but that's not who you are. That's like superficial. What you really are was never born and it never dies, because what you are is this entire field of infinite being. And it manifests as trillions of different life forms. And it manifests as the most distant galaxy and every subatomic particle and anything else that you might want to distinguish. We're that entire field of being. Once that's seen clearly, there's never a thought about death again. You don't have to worry about anything. And there's a poem by D.H. Lawrence called Pax, P-A-X. That poem captures the sense of how well everybody's taken care of. And it's a very short poem, but sometimes read that. It is really good, because he gives a sense of, once you see this, it's like you realize everything's taken care of. You don't have to worry about anything.
And that's why, we have come up with words like liberation, because it is freedom.
It is. And once you're free, you know you're free. And I think I mentioned, I wrote about this in my book. Even after every existential question had been answered, I no longer had any questions. I still didn't feel free, but I didn't know why. And I didn't know why until the me disappeared.
Mm.
And then I knew why. It was because it was a me that wanted to feel free. And as long as there's a me, there can never be total freedom. Once it is seen that me is an illusion, there's freedom. That's really what we're talking about, is liberation, whatever.
Because freedom just is.
Yeah, I don't particularly like the word enlightenment because it carries a lot of baggage.
Yeah.
So somebody one time said, "Oh, you think you're enlightened?" I said, no, I just was lucky enough to get all my existential questions answered. All right, because enlightenment carries a lot of other connotations I just soon forget. And it's sort of like the word God.
Right? I was just thinking that.
Right. Another word that's heavily loaded. All right.
Yeah.
And if you apprehend, or if this apprehends itself directly, you realize it's beyond gender, it's beyond name and form, it's beyond anything that the human mind can imagine. It is so far beyond the human mind that you're just simply in a state of awe. You just can hardly believe the vastness of that, the benevolence of that. It's just impossible to describe. But once that's seen, you don't ever have to worry about death again.
So once that's seen and known, liberation, freedom, can you go back? Can you become unfree?
There are actually people who have gotten free and who have gone back into the mind. There are some cases I know about like that. In most cases, because there was some aspect that wasn't realized. There's one really good example of a woman that I know who wrote a book about enlightenment. She had a phenomenal enlightenment experience when she was in college. I think she was 19, something like that. She was consumed by the question, what is reality? And she had this mind-blowing cosmic consciousness event that freed her. And she lived just a liberated life for several years, got married, had kids, and no one knew what she was talking about. She would always talk about how vision had changed and her relationships had changed, everything had changed. And she lived free for several years. And then she went back to school and to get a degree, and I think it was psychology. And she began to study and work on a master's degree or whatever. And as she began to spend all of her time thinking, she began to gradually fall back into the mind. And I knew her when we became good friends after I read her book, and we communicated a lot. And she was trying to get back to that state of freedom that she had felt. She felt like at the age of, I think she may have died at the age of 82 or 83. And the last time I talked to her, she had gotten back interested in, she'd found some Zen group that confirmed the fact that she'd had this huge experience when she was young. And they said, what you didn't understand was you have to keep meditating, practice. That's a whole Zen thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm crazy about that. But anyway, they sort of explained things to her, and she was trying to get back to that state because she had never really penetrated the fact that everything that happened had not happened to her. All right. She had never seen through that illusion. She really was, I won't say she was horribly suffering, but she was still trying to get something. All right. She thought she had something and she thought she'd lost it. Mm-hmm. So it is possible that somebody who could live a very free life can fall out of that. Mm-hmm. And I can think of two or three other examples of people that I've met and interacted with that the same sort of thing happened to. They had a huge explosion, were totally free, and gradually got caught in the mind again. Let's put it that way. Began to believe their thoughts. They never really become fully detached from their thoughts. And in Zen, what Zen is pointing to, in most of the non-dual traditions, they're pointing to non-abidance in the mind. In other words, for most people, the mind is dominant and it jerks you around. You have these ideas and your ideas jerk you all over the place. All right. Oh, I'm not good enough, or I don't have enough, or, all those kind of crazy ideas. Mm-hmm. There's non-abidance in the mind. None of those ideas apply. You're free of all that.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Hmm. I guess I wonder what motivates a person from what, I guess motivate would be the term, a person that is liberated or free. I mean, because we're so conditioned to believe that we need to make things happen. So a person that's liberated and free, when they get up in the morning, is it just an allowing and an unfolding of life to happen?
That's right. You realize that, for example, I'll ask people, maybe they have some interest, whatever it is. And I'll say, where did that interest come from? If you get interested in something, where did it come from? All right. You just suddenly have an interest in something. I grew up, I was always interested in science, and I was interested in astronomy and so forth. That's just how it unfolded in this particular organism. All right. And it's the same sort of thing with words like motivation. All that's highly abstract. All right. So it's like you're not living life, you're being lived by life. And you can just relax. And in the night, and here's one unusual thing, and we don't talk too much about this, but when the mind totally stops and there's total silence, there's no need to think about anything. You're not designing a house or a rocket ship or anything like that. Everything continues exactly the same, but there's no reflective thought whatsoever. There is literally no conversation going on in your head. And this has happened spontaneously to certain people. Gary Weber is a good example. Terry Stevens, who woke up and all of his trauma was gone after 2 months. And I can think of several other people that happened to. I have actually met a guy who was a manager at Dulles International Airport of all the air traffic controllers. And they had some sort of emergency show up. It was really, really frightening, and people running around like crazy trying to resolve this issue because planes are in the air and something had happened to the systems. Right in the middle of that, his mind suddenly went silent. And he said, I was able to resolve all this And I was totally stunned, the fact there was no thinking. It had suddenly stopped. And he said, I actually performed better than when I used to think.
Yeah.
And he said, people around me were going crazy. And he said, inside, I felt like I was laughing because I had it all under control. I knew how to fix it. It was just all spontaneous. And he said, and I said, and so what brought you to this non-duality meeting? He said, because after that, I got interested in spirituality. Because just like the alcoholics that had these sudden amazing experiences, these events happened where they got free, he realized something happened that he had no explanation for. And he realized something else took over.
Took over, yeah.
Yeah. And that's what brought him to spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
And that happens to people. Their mind will just suddenly go silent. And people think that they have to think to make things happen. You don't. The mind can be silent. You will still continue to carry on doing whatever is done, but it's sort of like you're just being lived by the vast intelligence that's running the whole show. And reflective thought is not necessary.
So you mentioned non-duality meetings. Is that something you facilitate?
No, I attend. Yeah, there are people that have Zoom meetings for people interested in non-duality. And so there are various groups that get together. The TAT Foundation is the one that republished my book. And they're an organization devoted to self-realization. And when I say self-realization, I don't really mean small s self-realization like in the psychological stuff. I'm talking about big self-realization. And it's an organization that was started by a guy named Richard Rose. And he influenced a lot of people. He's very charismatic. And he had a lot of really good ideas about people on the spiritual path need to be friends with other people on the spiritual path.
Mm-hmm.
And the people in the TAT Foundation, many of them have been friends for 30 or 40 years. And so the TAT Foundation has a retreat center in North Carolina. And a lot of the people that are members sponsor Zoom meetings and have different people. They'll have 20 or 30 people get together just to talk about this and have spiritual readings and so forth. Because we have learned that there are certain triggering effects for a lot of realizations. In other words, people, there used to be a British website that would ask people, if you've had a big spiritual experience or realization, send us an account of that and tell us what you're doing just prior to that.
Yeah.
And it turns out that most of them prior to that were either meditating or praying or reading spiritual literature or maybe spending time alone in the woods or something like that. So there's certain triggering events that tend to precede big spiritual insights and realizations and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm still kind of, in a process of knowing how I want to offer my time and energy towards supporting maybe liberation and freedom and self-realization, and because of the benefits that it will bring to humanity. Some of the hesitations I've had is a lot of times people will want to look at me as a teacher of some sort, and I'm just not comfortable with that because I don't know, it's not me teaching. And so it's kind of like at times it can make me feel like, I'm just uncomfortable.
And actually, I think probably a majority of the people that are called, quote unquote, non-duality teachers, very few of them consider themselves teachers.
Yeah.
They really just consider themselves pointers. We're just pointing.
That's right. Yeah. Pointer. That's
capture this.
Yeah, I like that. A pointer. Yeah. Yeah. Even, terms like that have, been given to Jesus, like a way shower, it still doesn't quite sit well with me. But pointer, I think I could be comfortable as a pointer. So in closing, Bob, is there anything you want to add to our conversation today?
Covered a lot of territory. I was going to see if there's any particular thing that might be fun to finish up on. Yeah, I'll just mention that the one meditative activity, there are all kinds of meditative activities, because Somebody asked Nisargadatta one time, who was a famous Indian sage, what must I do to find the truth? And he said, to find the truth, you must go beyond the mind. And by that, he meant go beyond the intellect, right? There are dozens of ways to go beyond the intellect for anybody interested. In most cases, it's by pursuing some sort of a meditative activity. The one that I found really helpful, mainly because it's informal, you don't get attached to it, and you can do it anytime, anywhere. If you're driving the car, if you're walking in the woods, just look and listen. In other words, rather than reflect, rather than worry, rather than think about the future, just look. Simple looking is beyond the mind.
Just look and listen.
That's right. It's just like being like a little child. Interact with the world directly. And the more you do that, the more you begin to feel one with what's going on.
And you actually have, I don't know what letters or words you kind of put together.
ATA minus T.
Yeah.
I made that distinction because one time I was on a talk or a presentation, and I used to use the word ATA, attending the actual. And by that I meant this is actual, hand is imaginary. Attend the actual. All right. And somebody said, well, aren't thoughts actual? And I thought, well, they're not actual in the same sense of something physical, but I thought, yeah, they do occur. So I thought, okay, I'll make a distinction. People who practice mindfulness. Mindfulness is a meditative activity where you sort of step back psychologically and you watch everything. So you're looking at feelings, thoughts, the exterior world, the whole bit. Since I had spent so many years thinking, I really wasn't interested in the thoughts because I knew thoughts weren't going to give me the answer. So I said, okay, let's call what I'm talking about ATA minus T, attending the actual minus thoughts. All right. So, and like mindfulness would be ATA plus T. All right. So that's why I made that distinction, just to make it clear what I was talking about. It's slightly different.
ATA
minus T, attending the actual minus thoughts, because thoughts are sticky. And my attitude was, okay, most people that practice mindfulness, and I know a lot of people that practice mindfulness, but when they practice mindfulness, some thought will come up and they'll wake up 10 minutes later, having ridden the thought train off into the distance somewhere. And my attitude is forget thoughts altogether. Just look at what's right in front of your eyes. Listen to what's going on right now, whether it's a bird song or whether it's the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. It's really a simple practice, a simple activity that you can do anytime, anywhere. In Zen, people practice this formal meditation. They get very attached to it. You don't get attached to ATA minus T. And so you could sit in an easy chair at night, for example. You can close your eyes if you want to and just listen to whatever sound is there. That would be ATA minus T.
Because something I was thinking this morning is that I really enjoy inner silence, but I really enjoy silence. But what I was thinking was, in a place of oneness, there isn't a separation between silence and sound. Silence is sounding. It's all one thing. So you may get to that place of no thoughts and be in kind of a peace and silence, but sound still arises because it's all,
Yeah, silence underlies everything. It's always there. And that is actually another practice. You can actually practice just being silent. But most people can't do that starting out. That's usually too difficult. But you can there's actually one of the major meditative activities in Soto Zen is actually becoming highly alert with no focus whatsoever. Just remaining in a state of alert silence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as much as silence is sounding, stillness is moving. So, and I'm saying that because sometimes it seems like people think that spirituality or enlightenment or liberation, self-realization, is some kind of getting to something, and it's really just the fully being immersed in what is, and it is ordinary.
Right. That's
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah.
And that's why we say that ultimately it's just very ordinary. You're not really living your life. You're being lived by this. And you can relax and just be lived. And it just all unfolds however it unfolds.
Yeah. So it's not something to figure out.
Yes. That's right. That's right. And in a sense, you're not getting anything. You're sort of letting go of everything.
Ah.
It's more of a path of subtraction than it is addition.
Ah.
And so a lot of times people will be talking to me and I'll say, that'd be a good idea to let go of. Because I can see how the idea is causing them stress, you know?
And even, I've heard people talk about enlightenment as a sense of attaining enlightenment. I'm like, well, if you are attaining it, then you're not going to have it, really.
Especially when you realize there's no me who can attain it.
Yeah.
And that's the cosmic joke. All right. Everybody who wakes up to this, that's what they laugh about. There's an automatic laughter that comes up because you realize there never was a separate me here to get anything.
Yes.
Right? I'm always here, and I'm already what I've been looking for.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that's why you can't practice your way to being what you already are.
Yes. Yes. And the realization of that, it is kind of like, oh my gosh, the joke was on me all along. Oh my goodness.
The joke is always on me.
Oh, well, thank you for this refreshing conversation. I truly enjoyed it, and I'm going to enjoy the rest of this day and take a walk on the bike trail and do, what is it? Actual
ETA minus T. Attend the actual minus thought.
attend the actual minus
Right.
thought.
Yeah. Just look and listen.
Look and listen. Well, that's what I'm going to do with at least part of my day today. Thank you so much, Bob. I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation. And I think these kind of conversations are beneficial.
They can be.
Yeah.
In amazing ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Bob. Bye-bye.